Between 1480 and 1530, the Spanish Inquisition processed over 2,000 human beings through a single tribunal in Toledo. Of those, historians estimate roughly 1 in 5 was handed to secular authorities for what the church politely called relaxation. That word, relaxation, was the official Latin legal term for burning a person alive. They had a bureaucratic euphemism for it. They had paperwork for it. They had a form you filled out before you fed a human being to fire in the name of a loving God. This is not a story about monsters. It is worse than that. This is a story about systems, about robes and seals and ink-stained fingers that processed human suffering the way a mill processes grain. Methodically, efficiently, and with absolute theological confidence. These are the most agonizing, humiliating, and grotesque religious punishments ever devised, ranked not by body count, but by the sheer ingenuity of the suffering. The Strappado. Italy, 13th to 17th century inquisitorial courts. Before the Inquisition needed a confession, it needed a tool. And for 2 centuries across the courts of Italy, France, and the Iberian Peninsula, that tool was deceptively simple: a rope, a pulley, and gravity. The Strappado, derived from the Italian strappare, meaning to pull, was the Inquisition's preferred opening act, not its finale. Its warm-up. Here is the elegant, bureaucratic horror of it. The accused's hands were bound behind their back. The rope was threaded through a ceiling pulley. They were hoisted, slowly, deliberately, until their feet left the ground entirely, their entire body weight suspended by their wrists wrenched backward. The shoulder joints, designed by anatomy to pull forward, were now being asked to do the opposite. Then, without warning, the examiner would release the rope. The body dropped, stopped just before hitting the floor. The sound, witnesses recorded, was like green wood splitting. Sometimes weights were attached to the ankles first. Sometimes the drop was repeated 6 times, 8 times. The Inquisitor's Manual. Yes, there was a manual. The Directorium Inquisitorum specified that the procedure could be paused to allow the accused to reflect on their answers. This was considered mercy. What makes the Strappado historically singular is not its violence, it is its plausible deniability. Church doctrine technically forbade drawing blood. The Strappado, most of the time, did not break the skin. Shoulders dislocated, tendons shredded, joints separated from their sockets like fruit from a stem. But the skin? Largely intact. On parchment, it was clean. The body, however, was never clean again. They built a theology of pain that left no visible wounds, and they called it justice. The auto de fe of María de Bohorques, Seville, Spain. September 24th, 1559. María de Bohorques was 20 years old. She was the daughter of a nobleman. She spoke Latin, Greek, and Hebrew fluently. A Renaissance woman in the most literal sense, educated far beyond what her era thought appropriate for her gender. She was also, according to the Tribunal of Seville, a Lutheran heretic. Her crime, distilled to its essence? She had read the epistles of Paul and arrived at conclusions that differed from Rome's. She had thought for herself. In 1559 Spain, that was not philosophy. That was a capital offense. The Inquisition did not simply take her to trial. They took her to pieces, methodically, over months. The Strappado was applied. She was questioned through the night. She gave names. Whether from conviction or agony, history cannot say. And then she recanted those names, and then she was broken again. The tribunal noted, with clinical precision, that during one session her arm was put out of joint. She arrived at the auto da fe, the grand public ceremony of acts of faith, in a procession through the streets of Seville. Thousands watched. The theater of it was deliberate, meticulous. She wore the San Benito, a yellow penitential garment painted with flames and demons, designed to mark her as condemned for eternity. Her name would be embroidered on a replica hanging in her parish church long after she was ash. Her family's honor destroyed. Her name weaponized as a warning. She was garroted at the stake before the flames were lit. A mercy extended to those who confessed at the last moment. 20 years old, a library behind her eyes, smoke on the wind. The Inquisition filed her case in triplicate, the ordeal of boiling water. Medieval Europe, 9th to 13th century, sanctioned by papal decree. Before the Inquisition formalized its machinery, the Church had a simpler solution for determining guilt. Ask God directly. The ordeal, Judicium Dei, the judgment of God, was Europe's dominant legal technology for centuries. It operated on a theological premise so audacious it borders on surreal. An all-knowing God would physically intervene in the material world to reveal the truth. All you had to do was subject the accused to sufficient agony, and the Almighty would make his verdict legible on their flesh. The ordeal of boiling water was among the most common variants. The accused plunged their arm, up to the wrist for minor charges, up to the elbow for serious ones, into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone placed at the bottom. The arm was then bandaged, sealed with the bishop's ring, and examined 3 days later. If the scalding had healed cleanly, you were innocent. If infection had set in, if the skin had blackened, blistered, wept, you were guilty. The medical reality. Infected wounds were the norm in the 9th century. Clean healing was the exception. The ordeal, in practice, was a sentence wearing the costume of a trial. And yet it functioned. For 4 centuries it functioned, because the accused believed in it. Priests believed in it. Judges believed in it. The psychology of confession under the ordeal was staggering. Many accused confessed before the water was ever heated, simply from the terror of divine judgment. The boiling water was almost secondary. The Church abolished the ordeal in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, not because it was cruel, because the priests were getting uncomfortable administering it. The theology, they decided, was presumptuous. You shouldn't test God like that. The people whose arms had already gone into the water received no such theological update. Giordano Bruno, Rome, February 17, 1600. Giordano Bruno had been imprisoned for 8 years when the Inquisition finally lost patience. He was a Dominican friar, a philosopher, a cosmologist, and a man who had committed the particular brand of intellectual insolence that institutions find unforgivable. He had proposed, among other things, that the universe was infinite, that it contained countless other suns, countless other worlds, that the earth was not its center. That God, if God existed, was not the property of Rome. He refused to recant. This is the detail that history must never lose. He was given every opportunity to live. 8 years of imprisonment, multiple hearings. The inquisitors, men of some education themselves, engaged him in theological debate. He was not an illiterate peasant stumbling into heresy. He was a peer, intellectually, of the men judging him. He still refused. The sentence was delivered. He was to be burned alive. Tradition holds that when the verdict was read, Bruno looked at his judges and said, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." February 17th, Rome. Campo dei Fiori, the field of flowers. He was let out at dawn. The tongue screw was applied first, a metal device that clamped through the tongue and the floor of the mouth simultaneously, silencing him before the crowd assembled. The Church had learned, by 1600, that martyrs were most dangerous when given a final speech. No last words. That was the design. The pyre was lit. It took time. It always took time. A slow fire, witnesses noted, beginning at the feet. Bruno did not recant. Today, a bronze statue stands on that exact spot in Campo dei Fiori. His face points toward the Vatican. The Catholic Church has never formally rehabilitated him. The field of flowers blooms every spring, directly over the coordinates where they turned a mind to cinders and called it theology. The Rack and the Case of Anne Askew. London, England, July 16th, 1546. There is a particular category of historical atrocity that is distinguished not merely by its brutality, but by the identity of who was made to endure it. Anne Askew occupies that category alone. She was a poet, a Protestant theologian, a woman who had memorized vast tracts of scripture, who engaged in public theological debate with clergymen, who wrote letters of such clarity and intellectual force that they were smuggled out of prison and circulated across Protestant Europe. She was also, by the summer of 1546, a prisoner in the Tower of London. Her crime? Heresy. Her specific offense? Refusing to believe in transubstantiation, the Catholic doctrine that the bread and wine of the Eucharist literally became the flesh and blood of Christ. She was 25 years old. What happened next is documented in her own words, in a text called The Latter Examination of Anne Askew, written from her cell. It is one of the most devastating primary sources in English history. The Lord Chancellor of England, Thomas Ridley, wanted names. He believed, correctly, that Anne Askew had connections to Protestant noblewomen at court, possibly to the Queen herself. He needed those names. He ordered the rack. The rack was London's signature instrument, a wooden frame on which the prisoner was laid flat, wrists shackled to a roller at one end, ankles to another. The rollers were turned in opposite directions. The body was stretched, joints separated from their housings in sequence. Fingers, wrists, elbows, shoulders, hips, knees, each with its own distinct register of sensation. When the constable of the tower refused to continue, he deemed it too extreme. Risley and his associate, Sir Richard Rich, worked the device themselves, two of the highest officers in England, on their knees, turning the handles. When it was over, Anne Askew could not walk, could not stand. She had to be carried to her execution in a chair, her joints so thoroughly destroyed that her body would not support itself. She was burned at Smithfield on the 16th of July, 1546. She still gave no names. Here is what the history books record next. She had gunpowder tied to her, a mercy extended to accelerate the end. She was seated in that chair, destroyed at the stake. The fire was lit. She did not break. Not at the rack. Not at Smithfield. The men who operated that rack held the highest offices in the land. They signed letters with royal seals. They attended church. They went home to their families. Anne Askew went home to something they never built a theology sufficient to contain.